Greetings, fellow Whovians, and welcome back to Unrepentant Geeking, the show where a geek can be a geek. As always, I am your host, Shaun, and let's just skip the preamble and get right to it, because there's a lot to talk about regarding this week's episode of Doctor Who. So, Rosa is a rather astounding episode of Doctor Who, for any number of reasons. But one of the big ones is the fact that it's something the show used to do all the time and hasn't really done in a long while. And that's due basically a proper, true, honest-to-God historical episode. Or at least I think as close as you're going to ever get in the current modern era of Doctor Who. Now, let me clarify what I mean by that, because if you're a newer Who fan, you may not understand what I'm talking about, because you'll be going, but Shaun, Doctor Who goes back in time all the time. Ha ha, see what I did there? And I would go, wow, your sense of humor is almost as bad as mine. Okay, but seriously, yes, there are lots of Doctor Who episodes that deal with the past, where he meets Agatha Christie or Charles Dickens or whatever, or now she. The Doctor goes back in time all the time. Doctor Who in the new era has had plenty of episodes set in the past. But the key thing is, those aren't really what I'm referring to when I talk about historicals. You see, if you don't know, back in the day, Doctor Who started out as children's programming. Very specifically children's programming, and even more specifically, it was at least nominally supposed to be educational. The whole idea is that's why they did time travel, so that the Doctor could go back in time and mess about and teach kids about various points in history. And that's why you also had two teachers and a young audience stand-in child character as a part of the main cast going along with the Doctor, so that one who was a historian and one who was more scientist and basically could help fill in all these little facts. Now, the point is that these historical episodes weren't supposed to have any kind of big science fiction elements, and a lot of them didn't. There are a number of what we call true historicals or historicals, depending on how you want to phrase them, and these are mostly confined to the First Doctor era, where the Doctor just kind of gets into trouble in the past with the natives, as it were, and there are no sci-fi elements besides, obviously, the Doctor himself. There are no aliens. There are no whatever. There's just the Doctor, and the problem, whatever they're facing, comes out of quote-unquote natural circumstances, as it were. Now, that was supposed to be what the show would primarily be all about, and then they ended up doing the Daleks, and the Daleks became so huge, and it changed the course of Doctor Who forever, and so on and so forth. So, depending on who you ask, it's been a long time since we've gotten anything actually resembling a proper historical episode of Doctor Who. Some would say the last actual historical was the second Doctor story, the Highlanders, which introduced one of the all-time great companions. Another would say that it was the Black Orchid, a fifth Doctor story set in 1925, so it was set in the past as of that relative to its broadcast, and there are no real science fiction elements, although that one doesn't deal with famous historical figures or events, which was also a big part of the historicals generally. Some would even say that The Smuggler is a first Doctor. I believe that's a first Doctor. Let me see. Yes, that The Smugglers from the fourth season is the last true historical, because for a variety of reasons. The point is that they fell out of favor and basically dropped away largely after the first Doctor, and as the show began to embrace the more fantastical and left largely behind its more educational elements. It just became an outright science fiction fantasy adventure, not explicitly aimed at kids, not necessarily aimed at just adults, not, this wasn't rated R or anything like that, but it was no longer intended to be a kid's show in the same way that it was early on. It had broken through. It was no longer just as kid stuff, and was starting to become more of the cultural, icon for British viewers and things like that for the world that it would eventually and has currently developed into. So that brings us to Rosa, the third episode of the 11th season of Doctor Who, written by Chris Chibnall and Mallory Blackman, directed by Mark Tondry, and aired earlier this week. And now technically this doesn't quite fit into being a proper historical, because there is a sci-fi element, but it's a very slight element. You could almost do this story without it, except that having that element gives the story added power, because it allows them to make some very direct statements, which we'll get back to in a second. But this is easily the closest Doctor Who has come to a true historical, I think, in a long time, because, there's a lot of... If you go into this and you don't really know much about Rosa Parks, you'll learn quite a bit. You'll learn quite a bit about her. I mean, not as much as if you actually sit down and read an actual book, goddammit. Read a book! No, okay, sorry. But no, you get a lot about her, but it's also... The Doctor is there, and the Doctor definitely interacts with Rosa Parks, and the Doctor definitely is participating, but it's not really her story. It's not even really her companion stories. It's sort of. It's Rosa's story as much as it is anything. She's the title character very justifiably. And that gives the whole episode this kind of feel. I got into Doctor Who back in the Fifth Doctor era. That was my first real exposure to the Doctor. And obviously, one of the problems with the historicals also is that, frankly, a lot of the historicals are lost. Many of the historicals are just completely lost. We have novelizations, we have audio that was recorded off TV, but the actual original, those are gone, and they ain't ever coming back. So that's also hasn't helped. But I'm familiar enough with what has survived over the years and what has been reconstructed from what didn't, to get a feel for what those old real historicals. These days, most Doctor Who episodes that go back in the past are called by the fan base pseudo-historicals to differentiate them. That's where you get the thing where it's the alien menace, and the history thing is at times almost incidental. In a way, it's complicated, basically. Rosa, basically, it just feels more like a spiritual successor to the old original historicals. And I don't know if that was the intent. I don't know if that's just a coincidence because of the kind of story they ended up telling. I don't know. And honestly, it doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, Rosa is one hell of an episode of Doctor Who. It's a incredibly strong, powerful, and uncomfortable outing for the series. Doctor Who, like many science fiction, science fantasy, whatever, many genre shows, often, takes part in metaphor. It uses metaphor as a stand-in to comment on real-world issues in a way that can let it get away with things that maybe it wouldn't be possible to tackle directly at the time because of how controversial it would have been, or how charged it would have been, and so on. That's been true about genre fiction as long as there's been genre fiction in whatever form. It's been a huge part of shows like Star Trek. God, Star Trek's bread and butter at times. Every season of every show loves to deal with that little metaphor where they can go nudge, nudge, wink, wink. See? This is what we're talking about. You know what we're talking about, but we're not actually saying it. And God only knows Doctor Who tends to traffic in a lot of that itself. It's no, and that's not a bad thing. I'm not saying this as a criticism. I understand why it's done that way, and sometimes metaphor can be very effective in making a point, because it can point out how ridiculous and nonsensical the thing it's trying to comment on is when you just put it in a different light, when you state it in a different way instead of in a way that's so ingrained socially and emotionally, and it can really be a powerful tool. But you know what else could be really powerful is to discard metaphor for once and just face something head on, and that's what Rosa does. And because it does that, because of the way it does it, we have a triumph of an episode, and an episode that so easily could have gone wrong. Like, I can picture... Okay, the best thing this episode does, the best thing it does, and the big mistake that it avoids, that it so definitely avoids, is it doesn't have the Doctor intrude upon Rosa Parks herself. And yes, I guess I haven't actually said what the plot is. The plot is that the Doctor and her new companions, she's still trying to get them home. She doesn't quite have control over the TARDIS, and the TARDIS sticks them in 1955, Montgomery, Alabama, just a couple days before the famous, Rosa Parks incident that kicked off in a way, was a major turning point or a major starting point, depending on how you want to describe it, in the civil rights movement of that time. It was a huge moment in history, especially, for a lot of people, and it resonates today, and with good reason. And as it turns out, they're there because there's a time traveler from way in the future who's messing about and trying to do something terrible, and he's an asshole. And yeah, basically he's an asshole. He's a total white supremacist asshole who's just trying to mess with history in little ways to try and, make things be the way they should be. Ugh. So, yeah, that's the plot. But what the show doesn't do, what the episode doesn't do, is it doesn't have the Doctor inspire Rosa Parks. I could totally picture the original series, the original Classic Who, tackling Rosa Parks. Not this episode. The original show would have never had the balls to do something this direct, this straightforward, this unflinchingly honest. And again, that's not even, it comes off harsher than maybe I intend. I wouldn't, they shouldn't have. They wouldn't have been prepared, they wouldn't have been equipped, and it would have been bad. But even just trying to deal with Rosa Parks at all, I could totally see a version of Classic Who, or maybe even early on in New Who. I could see a Ninth Doctor or a 10th Doctor episode where Rosa Parks, some sort of time travel shenanigans are going on. It's the Master, or the Daleks, or the Cybermen, or who knows what. And somehow or some way, Rosa Parks gets flung into the future, or into space, or crap like that. Somehow, the Doctor meets up with Rosa Parks, and maybe it's early on in her life, and the Doctor ends up inspiring her, and there's some sort of metaphor for racism going on that resonates with Rosa Parks, and she looks up adoringly at the Doctor and goes, "You've changed everything for me," and yeah, it would have been awful. It would have been. That's the kind of thing, if they had done, we would be looking back now and going, this is one of the most embarrassing moments in the history of this show. This is something like, this is one where they should burn all the tapes and not save it, because, oh my god, would that have been, even if it was coming from a well-intentioned place, that would have been awful. That would have been disastrous. And any variation of that in this episode would have equally been a bad idea. But no, we meet Rosa. First of all, the show even starts out with a scene that's based off a real scene, a real incident in Rosa Parks' life, from years before the big incident, where she has a different incident on a bus, and it's it kicks off the episode, and it kicks it off hard and sharp, and it's uncomfortable to watch, and that's good. And there's a lot of scenes like that in this episode where I was wincing and where I was going, oh. But I was glad I was, because frankly, while we have come a long way, we haven't come nearly far enough. And as we have seen for a lot of people, be they black, be they a woman, be they trans, be they queer in any way, be they any number of situations, the fight is long and is not over. The fight is just, if anything, we are standing on the precipice of what feels like a potentially, not just a step backwards, but, like a giant leap backwards, and it's terrifying, and it's hard, and it's infuriating. And that's why this episode is not subtle at all. Even by Doctor Who standards, Rosa is not subtle with its message and with its themes, and good. Because sometimes you can't be subtle. Sometimes you need to be the metaphorical equivalent to a punch in the face, a sharp slap, to make clear how awful this was, the nightmare it was to live like this, to not be normal, to not be white in this period. And I grew up in South Carolina. We moved there when I was about 2 months old, and we lived there until I was 11. And I'm not black, and I don't know what it's like to be an African American, and I'm not even going to pretend I do. But I am Jewish. And I was, like, for example, in my elementary school, which was a sizable elementary school, okay? This was a large school. I was one of only 2 Jewish kids in the entire school. And when I was 6, I had an older kid confront me in a bathroom with a couple friends, shove my head in the toilet, piss on me, and then punch me repeatedly in the face, along with while his friends kicked me, because I was Jewish. He made it very clear. He said a lot of horrible words that, in some cases, were the first time I'd ever heard these words. It was a fucking hard experience. So, I mean, look, I'm not saying I don't know what it's like. You know, because I look and tend to present male, and because I am white, and because you can't tell I'm queer necessarily just by looking at me when I'm walking down the street, I don't have any idea what it's like to be black or to be Latino or to be, to be any of these, to be non-white. But I at least have had painful, direct experiences with the horrors and the pain of anti-Semitism, of variations of bigotry and hatred. And I can tell you that incident scarred me for many years, and it changed everything, and anyways, I don't want to make this about me. The point is, I thought the episode was very effective at addressing these issues, and not just through Rosa Parks herself, but through our characters. I like what it did with Ryan and Kaz. I love the scenes. Anytime we get a scene with Rosa, but especially with Ryan and Kaz, it's so effective. And I have to give so much credit to Vanette Robinson, who just absolutely nails playing Rosa Parks. You can see the dignity and the strength in her. You can see the humanity. You can see the frustration, the exhaustion. You can see just this wide range, and you can ultimately see the strength. And like I said, this is not a subtle episode. And when it cuts to Rise Up, playing during the climax and during the closing theme, I know some people commented maybe that was a little over the top, but I'm like, no, I don't think it was, because A, the episode earned it, and B, hammering it home in this case is appropriate, is the right thing to do. This is not a time in general, and this is not an episode in specific, to be subtle on the issues of racism and bigotry. So if you're going to do this, you need to do it right. And I feel like, thanks to a remarkable script by Maury Blackman and Chris Chibnall, I think they did it right. Like I said, this was at times hard to watch. And it's interesting because earlier in the day that this episode aired, I also saw The Hate You Give. So I kind of got a double feature, in powerful, uncomfortable, but all the better for being uncomfortable, stories of the impact and the poisonous nature of racism and the way it can play out. And I really appreciate that it does this. And if at times maybe it slightly preaches, I don't think it ever comes off actually as preachy. I don't think the lack of subtlety in this case is at all a problem. Because again, they're not dealing in metaphor. They're dealing with actual facts. They're dealing with actual history in a stark, revealing way. And overall, this was a great standalone episode of TV in and of itself, but it was also a great continuing episode of Doctor Who. Everybody gets a moment. The Doctor gets some fun stuff. I really like that scene with Bradley Wash's Graham at the end, where he doesn't want to be the one who's making her get up, but he, the idea that he's got to stand by for the course of history and the pain that brings him. And of course, like I said, Yaz and Ryan, they get some great scenes. That scene with them behind the dumpster, where they're talking about, there's still shit they both deal with. And it's good that they highlight that. That scene is so important because it makes it clear. We can't just look at racism as a thing of the past. It's not just a problem of the past. It is very much 100% a problem of today. And that's what makes an episode like this so vital. This was an episode watched by 6.39 million viewers overnight, I believe, in BBC. I don't know if that's... Sorry, I pulled up the ratings and now I realize... Okay, yeah, that was in Britain, and over 800,000 viewers in the United States on BBC America. So over 7 million people, and it's the kind of thing this is the kind of thing you want 7 million people to see, and you want it to be a stark thing for those of us who have the privilege to not always have to have racism as this constant, overhanging thing. Something like this is important as a powerful reminder of it, but also as a powerful reminder that even in the darkest moments there is hope. And that hope can come from ordinary people just acting in extraordinary ways, but extraordinary in a way that's very human and understandable and any of us can do. Rosa Parks was a remarkable woman, but at the same time, she was also a normal woman. She was both remarkable and normal. And that's such that's part of why you could look back at her as this such an inspirational, aspirational figure. She was somebody, and I'm glad that they didn't blow it. Basically, they didn't make any of the mistakes that you could fear a genre show tackling something like this, especially this specific incident with this specific individual. Like I said, there's so many ways this could have gone wrong, so many ways this should have gone wrong. This was such a needle to thread, and I'm just gonna repeat it. They nailed it. And yeah, this would probably go. I think there'd be a definite argument for this being in contention for 10 all-time, to go on like any all-time top 10 episode list of Doctor Who. Which is not necessarily the same thing as favorite. I mean, I don't know how often I'm going to rewatch this episode because it is harsh and it is painful, but I'm so glad it exists, and I'm so glad that they did this and that they did it well. And yeah, this just continues to be a first-rate season of Doctor Who. The Jodie Whittaker era, the Chris Chibnall, Jodie Whittaker era is just shaping up to be something very special, and I'm really excited for what's next to come. So next week we go back to the present, and it looks like we're going to get some more fun alien shenanigans, and that's good. And I imagine next episode's going to be the one that's going to really cement them as a crew. Perhaps we'll see. I mean, they could have easily stretched this whole we can't quite get home thing out. I mean, that used to be the basic status quo for the show. I mean, for many years, the basic idea was these people would stick around with the Doctor because he couldn't reliably get them home. That was very much the status quo, especially in the early years and at various points. But anyways, overall, terrific episode of Who. If you haven't seen it, absolutely watch it. Even if you have people in your life who don't normally watch Doctor Who, this is an episode definitely worth trying to get them to see, just because it's such a worthwhile hour plus, just in its own right, divorced even of the larger context of the show. So, yeah. And that's going to do it for this episode of Unrepentant Geeking. Definitely be back next week with a review of the next episode of Doctor Who. Possibly going to finally get around to doing the Titans review after I watch episode 3. Maybe. We'll see. Yeah, Halloween thing isn't happening. I'm sorry. I want to do it right. And so either I'll wait till next year, or maybe I'll just do it later in the year. There's no reason we can't have spoopy fun any time of year. Keep the spoopy spirit alive all year. But anyways, definitely not happening very least next week. Sorry. Anyways, that's going to do it for this episode. So thank you as always for watching. And hey, till next time, this is Shaun Cronenfeld wishing you all long days and pleasant nights.